So hi everyone, and welcome to this climate seminar. I'm Charmilino and I'm project manager at Climate, and I'm going to be moderator of this session today. A session talking about the transition in the aviation industry. We're going to have two speakers, Sascha and Guido Palazzo, talking about that. It's an event co-organized with E4S. Don't hesitate during the presentations to add any comments or questions in the chat. I take the opportunity to tell you that before we start. So first, Sascha will present Towards True Climate Neutrality for Global Aviation, a negative emissions fund for airlines. We're going to have a short discussion with the assistants, the audience, and then Degrowing the Airline Industry, a Cultural Change with Guido Palazzo, and then a brief discussion also with the audience. So first, let me present Sascha. He's a researcher in societal transition at the EPFL Lab for Environmental and Urban Economics, focusing on actions leveraged to accelerate change, such as net zero and negative emissions. His work includes policy, financing, governance, and engaging stakeholders to win acceptance. Sascha, I'll stop sharing my screen and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will do a quick introduction and then please ask any questions that you may think of. So let's first see if this works. Can you see the
yes.
airplane?
Yes.
Perfect. This really started with a paper that Philippe Talman and myself wrote and published about 3 months ago. And hope you will be interested enough in the quick presentation to actually read the paper. It's a very neat analysis. What we tried to do is to answer the question what it would take for aviation to become climate neutral by 2050. Everybody, including the airlines and the airline organizations, agree that this is the objective. So we are all in great agreement on the objective, but the question is, how do we actually get there? And one of the challenges in climate neutrality is that we have this thing called negative emissions, where we can take some CO2 out of the air, but the quantity of that is limited to perhaps 10% of our emissions. And that 10% is enough for any individual sector. But every sector would like to get the 10% for itself. And that is a bit of a problem. So we look into a pathway how to avoid this. And by the way, Philippe, if there is anything you would like to add at any point, please do so. So what we start from the objectives that here on the left, you have the IATA, which is the organization based in Geneva that represents airlines. And to the right, ICAO, which represents countries. It's a UN body. And both of them have decided that net zero 2050 is the official goal. Here you have a picture to the right of the ICAO General Assembly in Montreal mid last year voting on this. So we all agree. The question is, how do we get there? And this is where the issues start. We have 6 main messages, and I will try to illustrate each one of them with a with a picture. And if you have questions on any of them, either interrupt me or ask afterwards. So the first message, and I will immediately explain what are these different lines on the graph, is that the climate neutral aviation is a much smaller aviation. At today's size, or at the size that it plans to grow, we do not know how to make it climate neutral. This thing called sustainable growth for aviation is not credible, and the technology that would theoretically make it possible is decades away and definitely not ready to be deployed worldwide by 2050. So let me explain the graph. In black, you have past passenger kilometers. RPK is the revenue passenger kilometer, the main metric in airlines, and it started from very low base in around 1940 to approximately 9 trillion passenger kilometers. That's a huge number. It fell by 2/3 during COVID, and now it has recovered one of those 2/3. So now we're at about 2/3 in 2022. These are just latest numbers that were published a week ago. We are now at 2/3 of the pre-COVID level. These black dotted lines is the official prediction. It's the official mid scenario of ICAO between now and 2050, which would lead to a growth to about 26 trillion passenger kilometers, which is of course huge. The CO2 emissions, you have them in yellow in past, and the CO2 emissions alone associated with the ICAO level development are these here in orange. No surprise there. They don't increase as fast as passenger kilometers because there's some increase in efficiency, but they still increase. The interesting thing is that in airlines, 2/3 of the effect is non-CO2. These are effects like the contrails, the condensation trails, the thin clouds that form behind airlines, and all the nitrogen oxides and soot and other things that are the result of combustion in 10,000 meters altitude. As a result, if you don't look at CO2, but CO2 equivalent, then we have the red curve, which shows that today aviation is contributing about $3 billion tons CO2 equivalent of a contribution to global warming, which is more than 5% of the worldwide total. So it's really huge. Here we made the lower bound. So this is the most optimistic set of assumptions based on the best possible type of alternative fuels, cleaner burning, better filling airplanes, and basically every single reasonable technological assumption that you can make. The lower bound is that we would get to about a slight increase from the current 3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. The official strategy is based on this thing. Somehow these 3 billion tons become zero in 2050. And for that, nothing short than a miracle is needed. A more realistic thing would look like this. And the more realistic, this is the same message rescaled. So we have the 9 trillion kilometers. In 2025, we start degrowing the passenger kilometers at about 7%, and we get down to about 15% of the pre-COVID level. So we estimate that based on reasonable technology development, more efficient airplanes, better filling, some reasonable quantity of cleaner fuels, etc., we can reduce CO2 emissions by 90% by reducing flights by 85%. That's dividing them by 7. If you look in the approximate level, that's about the level we had in 1984. Just complete coincidence, but it does correspond to 1984. The emissions would, of course, be much lower because the airplanes are more efficient, and those remaining 100 million tons can then credibly be removed using negative emissions. So that's the first message. Climate neutral aviation is much smaller. The rest of the presentation is actually probably even easier to follow. We built a model where we look into negative emission growth and costs and interest rates and all sorts of things. If you're interested, we can come back to that. And we produce a physical flow model of CO2 in and out. So here you have in yellow, the 1 billion tons current emissions of aviation. This is CO2 only. And we propose a reduction pathway, which is this reduction here. It's an exponential function at minus 7.3% per year that then stabilizes at 100 million tons. At the same time, we propose immediately here in green, investing in negative emissions that would over time grow in 2042, reaching the same level as emissions, making aviation climate neutral on an annual basis from 2042, and then eventually removing the past emissions from 2030. Why is this important? Because net zero is not only, 1.5 degrees, is not only getting to no new CO2 emissions before 2050, it also means respecting some kind of remaining climate budget. And that climate budget has been recalculated in the latest IPCC report and brought down to to different, we can bring it down to different sectors, but the reality is that around 2030, this will be exhausted. So any pathway that will eventually stabilize our temperature at around 1.5 degrees will need to remove emissions from 2030. This is what we propose to do here. And our second key message is that, of course, there is a time lag between the moment of emissions and the time lag where the negative emissions will be ready and developed at scale. And there is a risk. And because of that, we propose a global public fund to keep the money and invest as quickly as possible in removing these emissions. The scale of the fund is huge simply because aviation emits a lot. And here the scale is about $3.3 trillion over 40 years. This is bigger than the total climate finance worldwide today. This is the financial analysis of the fund. In blue, you have payments into the fund. In the beginning, there are lots of emissions. The payments would peak at around $130 billion a year. And then we would have outflows. That means we are investing in negative emissions. Over time, they reduce because there's less to remove and the price is coming down. Because of the time lag between money in, cash flow in and cash flow out, the fund would capitalize and accumulate about $1.6 trillion. All these numbers are big simply because aviation emits a lot. Okay, we also did a sensitivity analysis, which I don't want to bore you with too many details, but what we have done is we have taken the 8 main parameters and we have looked into the minimum, maximum, and some intermediate values and see how everything changes. For example, the interest rate, our central level was 2% per year, but we also calculated for 0, 1, 3, and 4%, as we did for negative emissions growth, cost of negative emissions, there's a range, etc. And all of these things, of course, produce different numbers. Our 3 main outputs in the simulation model were these 3: the US dollar price, the dollar price per ton removed. Our central number is $230 per ton. It's expensive, but it's not unpayable. The total amount of money invested, which is about $3.3 trillion. And then the year by which the cleanup, that means all the excess emissions from 2030 are removed, is finished. That is here 2072. There are some assumptions that are here highlighted in red that produce a bad outcome. So it doesn't work for any set of assumptions, but if we remove the extreme assumptions, we actually have quite a robust thing. Just to give you one example without commenting every single number in this chart, the central price is $230 per ton, but for any reasonable input parameters, it's between 200 and 250. You can get to more extreme numbers like 314 if you assume 0% interest rate, but this is very unlikely to be the case for the next 50 years. So in summary, with a set of reasonable assumptions and a reasonable range of those assumptions, we will have convergence on something that seems to be quite robust. This is important because, of course, we don't know what these parameters will be so much in advance. Okay, let's move on to the third main target, the third main message. Based on its track record, aviation cannot be trusted to decarbonize voluntarily and must be regulated. And this is, of course, a strong statement. So let me support it with some facts. Here on the right, you have 20 years of a number of targets that were set by the aviation industry. You have some companies like EasyJet, and you have bodies like the Federal Aviation Administration, European Commission, or IATA. And you each time have to the left the year when the target was set, and to the right the year when the target was either missed or abandoned, or in one rare case, on a very short-term trivial target, reached. So if you look at that track record of anything that the airline industry has said, does not make you believe whatever they say for the future. If you look at the main measure that they want to use to reach net zero, which is this thing called so-called sustainable aviation fuels, which are not sustainable at all. We analyze that in our paper. So the main measure, if you look at the credibility, here, these were targets as a percentage of all fuel that should be based on alternative fuels. And every single one of them was abandoned or missed. And in every single time by a factor of 10 or more. So the main measure has been missed repeatedly by a factor of 10 or more every single time. And the interesting thing is, of course, you didn't find these things on the websites of the different organizations. They were found using the Wayback Machine. So where you can have a copy of old versions of websites. Because, of course, if you look at them today, there is no trace on any of these organizations' websites of the missed targets. Anyway, in summary, airlines can collectively not be trusted on this, and they must be regulated to get to net zero. Let's move on. As a result, we propose a governance mechanism to ensure compliance, to mobilize the resources for the well-being of society and biodiversity, and in the end, create a future for aviation. And let me explain briefly how this works. We propose that ICAO, the UN body that groups countries together, would be the governance mechanism. The main thing they would do is this thing here, which is manage an annual auction of the number of flights that are allowed in a given year, which would follow this minus 7.3% to ensure that we get to the right level. Airlines would buy rights to fly. The money would go into the Negative Emissions Fund for Airlines, the NEFA, and that money would then go into biodiversity projects, nature-based solution projects with co-benefits for biodiversity and for society. Those projects would be invested in countries that are part of a so-called climate club, which are countries that will require participation in NEFA by airlines as a condition to access its airports. Now, this is quite important because this is an international business. So we can change perhaps the law in Switzerland, hopefully in 3 years' time, but nothing prevents an airline based in Switzerland to move to a different country where different laws apply. Nothing prevents it. So the only way to actually get airlines to act in accordance with this is to link access to airports to a payment to NEFA. So countries that do that, countries that require airlines to participate in the scheme would actually get access to these part of these $3.3 trillion in payment. And this is actually quite attractive for a country. Today, countries have airlines and their domestic flights as part of the country obligation under the UNFCCC. So they don't really know how to solve that. It is a source of headache and cost. And by adhering to this scheme, it would become a source of revenue. So I think this is quite attractive for countries. Let me finish my short introduction with an outlook for society. So our fifth key message is that from the perspective of the main stakeholders, they are big challenges, but they're not insurmountable. And many of these challenges have positive side effects. So this is a paper an article that I wrote for by IMD. By the way, I can actually put this link into the chat if anyone wants to read it. Here it is, where I examined what would be the effect of a smaller aviation on large companies with global supply chains, on academia that travels as much as you all know we travel, on agricultural communities that today get a large part of their revenues by exporting using the airplane, and then on the airlines themselves. Interestingly, for airlines, 1984 was a profitable and stable period. They were much more profitable than today. And let me then conclude. One of the things that we need to do is start a broad societal dialogue. I don't know if our solution is the best possible solution. This is one possible solution, but we need a broad societal dialogue around this. And as a small effort in that, other than the events we are doing, discussing, and this climate talk, etc., there was a series of, I think, 7 different articles in different newspapers. Here you have some of them, because we need to bring this into a broader societal debate. And let me actually finish my presentation by summarizing. Our 6th and key message is that seen as a whole, this approach would reverse both globalization and deregulation of aviation, and it will shift resources from the 1% richest humans, who actually are the most frequent flyers, to the rest of the humanity. And that would at the same time reduce biodiversity loss, the climate crisis, and slightly reduce inequality. It would also give a future to aviation itself, and for other similarly hard to decarbonize sectors. Just to help you imagine this. So imagine mid-1980s, imagine that you can fly basically anywhere in the world, but it's expensive. On average, this would be the end of low-cost flights, and the other flights would be about twice as expensive. So you would fly 1/7 as much as you fly today. It's approximately twice the cost for each flight. So you would pay still a lot less than you're paying today, simply because you fly a lot less. But still, you could have international conferences, you could still have supply chains. It just, the supply chain could not be entirely globalized and could not be entirely served by air travel. So there are big challenges, but this is certainly more than feasible. And what we would like to do is open a dialogue on this.
We're going to go on with our second talk. So I'm going to briefly present you Guido Palazzo. Guido Palazzo is a professor of business ethics at the Faculty of Business and Economics at the University of Lausanne. His research is focused on the responsibility of multinational corporations, unethical decision-making in organizations, organized crime, and storytelling for social change. He has published his research in journals such as the Academy of Management Review and the Academy of Management Journal. He is one of the most cited business ethics scholars in the world. Guido, the floor is yours.
I don't know how you reacted to listening to Sascha for the first time on this topic. My first reaction was to think about a quote from the essayist Mark Fisher, who once said that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, with capitalism being a placeholder for any kind of deeply embedded beliefs, lifestyles in societies. So it sounds so great, and so necessary, but how do we get there? If we, as a knee-jerk reaction, believe this is not possible, because it requires so much change and will face so much resistance. Maybe to start by giving you one term that you might not be familiar with, the term hope punk or solar punk. So this is novels. You see my slides? Did they move? Good, because I'm not sure. This is novels that try to escape from this "we are doomed" narrative into developing a positive future. And one of those is Kim Stanley Robinson's book, The Ministry for the Future. Some of you might have read it. Now, again, this is a positive draft, a positive narrative about the future. And if you look at how flying stops in this novel, this is what he writes. Everyone alive knew that not enough was being done, and everyone kept doing too little. So it was not really a surprise when a day came that 60 passenger jets crashed in a matter of hours. About 7,000 people died that day. Later, it was shown that clouds of small drones had been directed into the flight path of the planes. And the next day, flying stopped. So again, this is a positive outlook on the future that perceives the stopping of flying pretty much as impossible. So even in that possible world, people just refuse to stop flying. And the only way to stop it was green terrorism. Why is that? Well, maybe because flying is not just, and Sascha and I discussed this before, it's not just something that emerged in the last decades as a kind of human right. So I have the right to be mobile, to go to Mallorca on holidays, to fly at any point at a good price. It is also something that is deeply embedded in our narratives as a species. We want to fly. From Greek and Roman mythology on, and probably earlier on, you have this dream of flying. To take away that from humans is probably a little bit more difficult than convincing them to wear a mask during a pandemic. And that was already close to impossible for many people. So how do we change deep habits? Is there something we can learn from other change processes that succeeded in the past? And this is what I would like to focus on today, to give you a rough sketch of 3 examples where change was considered pretty much impossible, and yet it happened. One is the fight against tobacco consumption, especially of teenagers. One is the alcohol abuse disaster in Iceland. And one is the fight against organized crime in Sicily. If we go to the first one, the global fight against tobacco consumption, we all know that for decades and decades, we were drowning in a kind of narrative that presented smoking to us as cool, as a sign of adulthood, strength, for women of freedom, for people in Africa as liberation, of role modeling of the West, and so on. So it is deeply embedded in values. How did countries like Switzerland, like the USA, like Italy as a forerunner, change that? How could they reduce the consumption of tobacco? Well, they applied a double strategy. The first one is a cultural thing. So it has been called uncooling the cool. So to change the values of people, to make smoking not something cool and a sign of adulthood, but something of being pretty stupid and embarrassing. At the same time, there were infrastructural measures taken. So the space for smoking was limited. No longer on airplanes, no longer on trains, no longer in restaurants. You have to stand outside in the rain or in the cold to smoke. So the combination of these two has led to a significant reduction of smoking around the world in countries where this was applied. The second case, Iceland fighting alcohol abuse of teenagers. I don't know whether you know this, but Iceland had for many, many years a huge problem with alcoholism. So there was this questionnaire that they used to investigate the alcohol abuse of teenagers, where there was this one question that I just bring to you. Have you been drunk last month? Asked to 15 to 16-year-old children. 42% answered yes in 1998, 5% only in 2016. How could they reduce the abuse of alcohol so drastically? Well, they engaged in a program where they offered children and teenagers activities. We didn't say to them, this is from one of these organizers, you're coming in for treatment. We said, we'll teach you anything you want to learn: music, dance, hip hop, art, martial arts. So there was a huge after-school program rolled out in the country to engage children in activities other than standing outside and drinking. And you see the result, it's impressive. And again, you see this double strategy. On the one side, you provide new types of meaning. On the other side, this time it's not the limitation of space, it's the creation of alternative spaces. Like in the first case, you have a cultural and an infrastructural combination of activities. The third one is a study that I did myself with a colleague, Antonino Vaccaro from IESE in Barcelona. We looked into one habit that was perceived as pretty much impossible to change. I don't know whether you know this, but in Sicily, pretty much every owner of a business, big or small, pays protection money to the mafia. So there's someone coming every month and you give them an envelope with the money that you have been dictated to pay per month, estimated on your profit. Whenever people tried to change that in the past, their shop was burned down, the factory was burned down, or they were killed outright. If they would take a public stand against it, they were killed. In 2004, 7 young people who were finishing their studies at university didn't find a job, and they knew they would have to use connections, especially ones with the mafia world, to find a job in Sicily. And they didn't want to do that. They didn't want to compromise on their values, so they were angry. So one night, they put this poster all over Palermo, hundreds of them. And it translates to people who pays protection money is a people without dignity. And dignity is an important value in Sicily. And this created a lot of attention, so that at one point they had to either decide to stay anonymously or to turn this into a movement, which they decided to do. They created Addio Pizzo. Pizzo is the word for racket, for protection money. And they achieved something that was perceived pretty much as impossible before. Hundreds of shop owners put this logo into their window, Addio Pizzo, so pizzo free. They created a movement with schools, with consumers, with associations. And these are the numbers from 2012 when our study ended. This is much bigger now. Again, this would have been a direct way to your shop burned down or you being killed, and yet they achieved this. How did they do this? And again, you find the same double strategy, refining the values. What does dignity mean for you? Do you think that this would be something desirable in other countries, this kind of practice? Do you think it would be preferable to live in a world without that? And then creating alternatives, and in this case, especially safe spaces, where people understood, I'm not alone. I have hundreds of other peers around me, shops next door who do the same. Consumers who have declared, who have signed a declaration that they would prefer to buy at my shop and not somewhere else. So if you look at these three examples, what you find is always the same kind of strategy. And it's what I would call the pincer grip approach. First, you have to create a change of space, or you can call it infrastructure, which means you either limit space for the undesirable activity, or you create space for the desired activity, and then you change the meaning. And the meaning change can have various elements that reaches from, as I mentioned for tobacco, uncooling the cool, or to more general to say, well, disenchant the habit and enchant a different one, values-based messaging, and importantly, create new communities. If you want to be someone who changes things, you do not want to be alone. You want to be connected to others who think like you. That makes you stronger. That reinsures you in your identity, because you are threatening your own identity. If you go into our example today, we see some of these things already happening. The banning of short domestic flights in some countries. The discussion on whether or not one should limit the use of private planes, to forbid private flights outrightly. The return of the night trains, we've seen this in the discussion before. The expansion of the fast trains in Europe. Sascha mentioned that Europe could be a place where this starts. The fast trains can easily replace a lot of these flights. And also the fact that supply chains and business activities do not need these kind of flights anymore as they did in the past, because people connect virtually with their colleagues. Then you have the second aspect, the more symbolic change, the changing of meaning, which means at one front, the uncooling of the cool, so the moralization of aviation, the flight shaming, or the flight shame that we perceive, the guilt, to connect to other narratives like this is a thing of the rich and it increases the problems of the poor, to make it a symbol of the climate crisis. I see even happening this with regards to biodiversity. So to moralize something that before was morally neutral, like smoking, like drinking as well. And just to give you an example of that, this is an example of flight shaming that happened in Germany. People took the available information of private flights of one German billionaire, and they showed that he was flying hundreds of times, especially short-term flights, where he could have taken the train or the car or whatever. And just by exposing that, you create pressure. So flight shame and flight shaming, so the flight shame, the term from Greta Thunberg, is something that's super important. In any larger societal change process, disenchantment of what has been taken for granted is key. if you don't disenchant what is perceived as valuable, important, normal, necessary, you cannot enchant something new. What helps is probably this redefinition of what does it mean to be mobile, this renaissance of local roots, of not going too far, of producing, of living consciously, mindfully in local context. Networks that emerge, like the infrequent flyer network, super important that people connect and that we promote these connections, say you are not alone. But what we also need, I guess, is the radical flank. So these activists who go to these to Geneva airport or elsewhere and sit in front of private planes and stop it and risk their life and be more radical than most of us probably think we should be. So to summarize, what I think is necessary is to we make the pressure on the political system in a way that they must act. Sascha is counting on the political system to do something, but politicians do not act if they have the feeling that this will kill their re-election. So what we need is the rise of a counterculture, and this counterculture requires this pincer from two sides: this infrastructural changes, the cultural changes, bottom up and top down changes who reinforce each other. So this is what I wanted to share. So let me stop the sharing for our discussion. Thanks.